did. Oh gosh, they had a good time.
Did you know the other day when we were up here, when me and Shelley were, there were 3 sets of twins?
We have had a
We
lot
had
of
3
twins.
sets of twins.
Another one came later that day, yeah.
Is that right?
So it was 4 sets.
Wow.
Lots of twins.
Huh?
Lots of twins.
Yeah. They had one had a boy and girl babies that were like 7 months old, and they were the cutest little stinkers.
Well, we had later that day. We had another set, a boy and a girl baby.
Yeah.
But they're a little bit older. They were closer to a year.
Yeah. These were 7 months, and they were just cute as they could be. 2
And
sets of boys.
On the Mom and Kids Day, there were 2 boys. They looked like twins. So I'm going to say they were. They were dressed as the Mario Brothers.
They were cute.
Oh yes.
my gosh,
Yeah,
that was
the
cute.
that one lady had twins. The one that was so cool. She turns out she grew up in an Anglican convent
Yes.
in India.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think she might come visit us sometime. I hope she does.
Yeah, she was very interesting.
What did she think about the church when you?
She liked it. Yeah, she liked it.
Okay,
And
good.
her girls are twin girls that are 3 years old.
Well,
Well, let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and get rolling. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us together this morning. We ask that you would guide our conversation, guide our thoughts as we consider the life of your Saint Francis of Assisi. Help us to be more like him in humility and in service to the most neglected of society. We ask that you would help us to follow in his footsteps, that we might be more like Christ. We pray all this in Christ's name.
Amen.
All right, I'm going to begin today. If I had plenty of time, I would have set up the projector, but it's a little tricky. So what I'm actually going to do, I'm going to do this in a not so sophisticated way. I'm just going to show you on my laptop. I'm going to walk around with this for a second. What I'm about to show you is an image. This is the oldest known image of St. Francis of Assisi. This was painted sometime between 1228 and 1229, and Francis died in 1226. So this was painted just a couple of years, 2 or 3 years after his death. So people who saw him living were still around at this time, and this image was painted. And we can kind of pass this around. It's very simple. There's not much to it. Let me turn up the brightness here. But you can see here, of course, Franciscus. You see him. He's wearing his habit.
Does he have his hair shirt on?
He's wearing a dark gray hair shirt or a robe with a hood. You know, the garments of the poor with the signature rope belt there.
No stigmata.
That's right. There's no stigmata in this image, but we do see that start to become part of the iconography. Yeah, it's pretty
See, I look at
pretty
that
interesting.
He looks like he'd be a tall man. I think of him as being.
I think they're
You think
short.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that. We're going to talk about that here in a second. Chesterton will talk about his physical appearance. What do you think about him? Just any initial responses?
He's sort of nice looking.
He is nice.
Yeah.
Well, really.
He's a nice looking man, right? Yeah. A regular fellow, maybe.
Yes.
It's kind of interesting to just because there's something very realistic about
He
this.
doesn't look as swarthy as I imagine.
Yeah. Of course, he's very serene. Sort of has his hand in the gesture.
He looks taller, doesn't he? Big
See,
size.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna feel free to look at this in a little bit. I'll kind of leave this right here. Let's see what Chesterton has to say about.
Like he's staring at us.
Close it.
He follows you wherever you go.
We'll watch those eyes.
That's great. That's great. They're kind eyes.
Okay.
They're eyes, gentle eyes, eyes of mercy. This chapter that we're going to look at today from Chesterton is an interesting one. We may not go the whole time here. There's not quite as much that I want to unpack today as compared to some of the previous weeks. Today we're looking at chapter 6. The name of this chapter is The Little Poor Man. And Chesterton's goal here is to help us to see kind of an outside perspective of St. Francis. So if you remember last week, we were really trying to look at the inside of St. Francis's heart, right? We talked about Francis's transition after his experience in the dark cavern, and how he, in a sense, saw the world in a completely different way, almost as if it were entirely upside down. He was truly changed, and he wore the badge fool like a crown. He had made a fool of himself in this whole experience he had with his father, and he somehow, in this mystical transformation, decided that he would be a fool for the Lord, a jongleur, as Chesterton describes it. No longer a troubadour, but a juggler, a jester for God. So in this chapter, Chesterton wants to take a step back. We're no longer looking so much at the inside of St. Francis's heart and mind. Now we are, for the sake of a holistic picture, now we are going to view Francis as one might have encountered him on the road, right? And part of that involves his physical description. Let's see what Chesterton has to say. And again, this is based on images of Francis, the many stories of Francis. Chesterton is writing as if he's describing someone he knows well. Francis of Assisi was slight in figure, with that sort of slightness which combined with so much vivacity gives the impression of smallness. I think we can kind of imagine somebody like that, can't we? He was probably taller than he looked, Chesterton says, middle-sized, his biographers say. He was certainly very active, and considering what he went through, must have been tolerably tough, which is true. If you think about the incredible fasting and asceticism of Francis, he put his body through a lot, and I'm sure that showed. He was of the brownish southern coloring, with a dark beard, thin and pointed, such as appears in pictures under the hoods of elves, and his eyes glowed with the fire that fretted him night and day. There is something about the description of all he said and did which suggests that, even more than most Italians, he turned naturally to a passionate pantomime of gestures. If this was so, it is equally certain that with him, even more than with most Italians, the gestures were all gestures of politeness or hospitality. So in other words, Francis had this kind of, he had this vivaciousness, he had this which truly was the life of God bursting out from him, right? And it burst out in an incredible, unique, even eccentric way. There's nobody quite like Francis of Assisi in the life of the church. Chesterton says that he had this kind of, for as vivacious as he was, he also had this kind of reposeful quality, which we see come out in images like the one we looked at. You know, in images, iconography, statues, Francis has this kind of reposeful quality to him, and that's not inaccurate. Like we've mentioned before, it can be misunderstood. He was not a passive person by any means, but he did have a kind of reposeful attitude. And this is going to touch on something that we usually think about St. Francis. Chesterton says, what is commonly that this reposeful quality of Francis is commonly described as a love of nature. How many times have you heard St. Francis of Assisi described as, oh yeah, he's the one that really loved nature, right? Have you heard that before?
That's all you hear.
That's all you hear, right? Well, Chesterton says we are compelled to use the term lover of nature, and it is entirely the wrong term. St. Francis was not a lover of nature. Properly understood, a lover of nature was precisely what he was not. And what Chesterton means by this is that for Francis, he didn't take in nature as this big kind of homogeneous thing, that this thing called nature where all things together. No, for Francis, everything was particular. Everything was special in its own particular sense. So Francis wasn't interested in this big thing called nature. No, he was interested in when something presented itself to him, whether it was a poor man or a bird or whatever, He was interested in that thing as being a fellow creature of God. So it was not this kind of sentimental idea of loving nature. Francis loved all things that God created.
Is Chesterton trying to distinguish between people that worship nature?
I was thinking that.
That is part of it. In that, yes, because before we read Canticle of the Sun, where one of Francis's few written works, where we see him describing, the sun as his brother and the moon as his sister, and everything is a brother or a sister to Francis. And it's tempting to look at that and see a kind of, paganism almost. But you're right, Chesterton wants us to understand Francis as he needs to be understood, which is not at all pantheistic. Francis was not interested in that at all. The only reason he addressed things as his brother or sister was because they were fellow creatures of God, and they were worth attention. And Francis had this humble attitude in such a way that nothing he saw was worth passing by or scorning. Everything was worthy of being addressed with love because it comes from God. So he uses these familial terms to describe things, which sounds funny. It sounded funny in his own day. It still sounds funny to describe things as brother, sister, even inanimate things. Brother fire, right? I think Chesterton says somewhere, he would have been as happy saying Sister Julia as he would be saying brother table, right? because again, all things are from God, and Francis himself is from God, and so he addresses all of creation as being his brother and sister, and it's not this pantheistic thing. All of it is really kind of redounds unto God. It is praise to God. That's what's at the heart of Francis's attitude towards living things. Again, everything was particular. Chesterton says that for St. Francis, nothing was ever in the background, right? And he kind of uses the language of a play. How there's like background, there's like a wooden tree in the background that's just kind of hanging out back there. No, nothing was in the background. Everything was in the footlights. Everything was center stage for Francis. He saw everything as dramatic, distinct from its setting, not all of a piece like a picture, but in action like a play. A bird went by him like an arrow, something with a story and a purpose, though it was a purpose of life and not a purpose of death. A bush could stop him like a brigand, and indeed he was ready to welcome the brigand as the bush. Everything he welcomed. The poor, the wicked. He would have been happy to stop and chat with somebody trying to rob him. He would have loved that. In a word, we talk about a man who cannot see the wood for the trees. St. Francis was a man who did not want to see the wood for the trees. He wanted to see each tree as a separate and almost sacred thing, being a child of God and therefore a brother or sister of man. And now Chesterton will turn to talk about the kind of poetic quality, and this is where he kind of he wants to address that question of pantheism. He says that this is the quality in which, as a poet, he was the very opposite of a pantheist. He did not call nature his mother. He called a particular donkey his brother, or a particular sparrow his sister. He's eccentric and bizarre and challenging, but the one thing we cannot call him is a pantheist. He was very keen on God being the one who receives praise for all of the grandeur of creation. St. Francis was a mystic, Chesterton says, but he believed in mysticism and not in mystification. Okay? And what he means by that, he says, as a mystic, he was the mortal enemy of all those mystics who melt away the edges of things and dissolve an entity into its environment. So again, he's not worshiping this big thing called nature. He's looking at everything particularly everything is special and individual, and he addresses it as it comes by. Any thoughts so far? What do you guys think about this? Are you convinced? Was St. Francis a nut?
It's like I said to you a couple weeks ago, every sentence you're reading to me there screams high-functioning autism.
Maybe so.
That's just, I can't, I haven't read the book, obviously, I'm just a slacker back here following along, but that's from what you.
No, who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows? And when we look at the lives of many saints, it is tempting to see their various things.
We apply our modern.
We do. We apply. We psychoanalyze.
Definition, yeah.
We psychoanalyze, and sometimes that maybe can be helpful. Certainly for people that suffer from disorders like that, to see in the lives of the saints, oh, there's actually people like me. That's a legitimate thing. But yeah, who knows? Francis was a very before his transformation, he was a very social person, so he would have had to have been very high functioning and social. But yeah, who knows?
I think we can say that he viewed the world differently.
He definitely
There's
did.
no way we'll understand what that was.
Right. Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, there's no way that we can really. Hey guys, come on in. Dottie, can you say thank you, Miss Julia?
You're welcome, Donnie.
There it was.
We have cousins as well as kids.
Yes,
That's right.
indeed.
Cousins and kids today. They were here for Jack's party yesterday. But yeah, there really is. We can. I think we can get near to the heart of St. Francis, but really, what's happening in his heart is a mystery.
Yes.
It's hard to crack that open. And Chesterton himself will say, I'm trying to describe what is essentially a mystery. Who can fathom the depths of what God does in someone's heart? So yes, he saw the world differently. Perhaps his brain chemistry was even a little bit different. Who knows?
See, like that, most autistic people are so pure in their thoughts, and they always let you know exactly what they think, how they're feeling
Right.
about something. I mean, there's no, they
Yes.
don't think anything about, letting that be known,
Mhm.
which, that's interesting.
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
is.
no, really.
I was
mean,
telling
you say that, yeah.
Carl. There's a show that's out. It's pretty good. It's called The Chosen. I don't know if you guys have heard about this. It's a German. They take a lot of creative licenses, but overall, it's pretty good. It's pretty uplifting. But an interesting choice that this show made was that they portray Matthew the apostle as being on the autism spectrum very, very clearly, very intentionally. He's a
They make great tax collectors.
right, yeah, I mean, a very
Exactly.
yeah, very detail oriented, counting frequently, with doing money counting and that kind of thing. But it's really kind of interesting. And again, it's just imaginative, but yeah, kind of an interesting way to go. Yes, sir.
Just an off-the-wall question. Why was Judas the carrier of the money when they had a person who was used to doing it all his life?
That's a good question. Well, I wonder, did we ever learn what Judas's trade was before becoming? I don't know if we ever learned that. That's a good question. I truly don't know. Yeah, but they do make much ado of Matthew being a tax collector.
Maybe Matthew wanted to leave his old life behind.
Interesting. Yeah, maybe it was a kind of a rebirth thing. Yeah, that's a good point. Who knows? That's a good question. Any other thoughts so far? Any impressions of St. Francis as we've been looking at this
He kind
book?
of reminds me more of somebody that has like ADD. I mean,
Yes.
it's like
Yeah, he's definitely all over. Well, and he was certainly
impulsive.
impulsive. He leapt at things. He had an idea. If God told him to do something, he would just do it without thinking much about the repercussion. If a beggar said, give me the clothes, give me everything you have right now, and if he were far away from home, he would do it. He would give him everything he had without a thought of coming home. It's like the story of, I think we've talked about this before, when this was technically before his transformation, but it was one of those moments where we see the transformation kind of starting to take place, where Francis was visiting Rome. He was at St. Peter's, and he had this moment of just he saw people giving maybe not a whole lot of money to the church, and he just sort of he flung his money bag at the altar of St. Peter's, and he did that just impulsively, and then afterwards he didn't have any money to get home, so he had to put on the rags of a beggar. He exchanged his clothes with a beggar so that he could be a beggar and then beg for enough money to get home. That was his first experience begging, but again, a good example of his impulsive character.
He had a sort of the ultimate sense of equality of everything, where he
Definitely.
Somewhere in there he said a dragonfly is the same as a prince.
Right? Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Everything was,
Right,
nobody was
right.
better, nothing
Yeah.
was better.
Yeah.
It's all
And
different.
he certainly had a respect for authority. It's easy sometimes to view the story of Saint Francis in a kind of anti-clerical sense, but Francis was very deferential to the religious authorities. You know, he told once he had developed a following, you know, he told his friars, his brothers, he told them, when you go into a town, you know, the first thing you need to do is you need to ask the local priest if you have permission to preach and to do work in that town. And if the priest says no, you need to move on. That's don't be a jerk. And then Francis himself was very cautious when he was forming this order. He would not do it if he did not have the authorization of the Bishop of Rome. That's why he went to Rome to visit the Pope and received authorization from I think it was Pope Innocent III. So again, he was very deferential. He respected authority, but at the same time, he would treat a beggar with the same dignity as he would a prince or a pope. That's just who he was. Everybody that came into his field of vision was a beloved creature of God and worthy of respect, worthy of love, and worthy of being served. Francis served everyone and everything that came into his life. That was the kind of gospel obedience that he was interested in. Christ told us, be a servant. Okay, I'm going to be a servant to everyone. In my sermon today, I reference a line that actually comes out of this chapter, where this really neat line where Chesterton talks about how for Francis, usually there's one king and 100 servants around him, but for Francis, there were 100 kings and he alone was the servant. For Francis, he was a servant in a world of kings. Everybody was a king and he was the servant of the world. That's how he treated people, from the Pope to the beggar on the street. That was his obedience to the gospel. Let's see here. Chesterton, in this chapter, Chesterton does touch on the Canticle of the Sun, which we have read together, and that's worth printing off. You guys should print off Canticle of the Sun. You can find it easily online. It's out there. You can find English translations of it. It's a short work. It's a neat little poem to tuck away into your spiritual disciplines. It certainly opens your eyes to the glory of God in all creation. It's a really beautiful poem. Chesterton will describe the vivaciousness of St. Francis, and again, he's doing this from the perspective of outsiders and what he must have been like if you were to encounter him. And he wants to paint a picture for us by giving us a couple of little stories. One detail of Francis's life is one that comes near the end of his life, and this is kind of a brutal story, but it helps paint a picture in our mind of the dedicatedness of Francis's attitude. Francis's attitude, all of the stuff that we've been talking about, this attitude he had towards other people and to all of God's creation, this was not a show he put on. This was not something that he abandoned when times got tough or when it was difficult. This was at the very heart of his being. So let me just read you this story for a minute. And again, this comes near the end of his life. St. Francis was a dying man. We might say he was an old man. At the time this typical incident occurred. But in fact, he was only prematurely old, for he was not 50 when he died, worn out with his fighting and fasting life. But when he came down from the awful asceticism and more awful revelation of Alverno, he was a broken man. As will be apparent when these events are touched on in their turn, it was not only sickness and bodily decay that may well have darkened his life. He had been recently disappointed in his main mission to end the Crusades by the conversion of Islam. He had been still more disappointed by the signs of compromise and a more political or practical spirit in his own order. He had spent his last energies in protest. Let me just pause for a second. The events that Chesterton is talking about, Francis went to go visit the Sultan in the middle of the Crusades, right? Which is, you were going to visit the chief of the enemies. And his goal was to convert him to Christianity. And actually he was received kindly. He had a long conversation with the Sultan. He did not succeed in converting him. Francis was ready to die. It was a very real possibility that he may have been, oh, who's this guy from our enemies? You're done. But Francis was ready to do that, and he went to the Sultan, tried to convert him, didn't work, disappointing endeavor. Chesterton's also talking about how there were signs of compromise within his community. So Francis had started this order, the Franciscan order, and even in his own day, people were starting to grow lax with the rules and regulations, right? Do we really have to give up all of our possessions, right? Yeah, it's just not practical, right? Like that was but Francis would have none of it. Francis would have no compromise, and so those were the things he was dealing with at the end of his life. And again, Chesterton says he had spent his last energies in protest. Now, at this point, he was told that he was going blind. If the faintest hint has been given here of what St. Francis felt about the glory and pageantry of earth and sky, about the heraldic shape and color and symbolism of birds and beasts and flowers, some notion may be formed of what it meant to him to go blind. I'm sure he hated it, in other words. Yet the remedy might well have seemed worse than the disease. The remedy, admittedly an uncertain remedy, was to cauterize the eye, and that without any anesthetic. This was a medieval healing device. In other words, Chesterton says, it was to burn his living eyeballs with a red-hot iron. There's no getting around that. Many of the tortures of martyrdom, which he envied in martyrology and sought vainly in Syria, can have been no worse. When they took the brand from the furnace, he rose as with an urbane gesture and spoke to an invisible presence. Brother fire, God made you beautiful and strong and useful. I pray you, be courteous with me. There's such courage and grace in that attitude. But again, Francis did not abandon this idea. This was not some neat thing he came up with and said, I'm going to try adopting this attitude, and I'll try holding it on as long as I can. He had truly been transformed, and this was really how he saw the world. He truly saw all things belonging to God, and he addressed all things with courtesy. He was, above all things, a courteous person. Courteous towards the poor, courteous towards birds and beasts, courteous towards the red-hot iron which was about to hurt him. That was the attitude of Francis. That was his humility in the world. A humility that would light the world on fire with a movement for the gospel. If there be any such thing as the art of life, Chesterton says, it seems to me that such a moment was one of its masterpieces. Francis was an artist of sorts. He truly lived the art and the poetry of his theology. He lived it out in an extraordinary way. Again, there's this kind of humility. Chesterton says that Francis retained this permanent posture of a sort of deference. He was always deferential, always courteous to whoever came his way, to whatever came his way. He maintained this permanent deference as a way of obeying Christ and serving Christ in all people. Francis Chesterton says, saw the image of God multiplied, but never monotonous. So if Francis were to encounter a crowd of people, he would not be he would see everybody individually, right? He would see the image of God multiplied, not sort of, not this monotonous mass. He saw everything particularly. He saw everyone with dignity and particularity. It can only be conveyed by a certain grand manner which may be called good manners. We may say, if we like, that St. Francis, in the bare and barren simplicity of his life, had clung to one rag of luxury. There was one thing that he held on to, and everything else he gave up. And that one thing he held on to was the manners of a court, of a royal court, and everything was a king. Yeah, that's pretty much the point of this chapter. Any thoughts so far? Any reactions to this attitude of St. Francis? Is this even remotely possible for us to put on
No.
as Christian people?
Not for me, not me.
It's some part of it.
Some part of
obviously.
it, yeah.
Yeah, it's not practical for everyone to give up all
That's
the
true.
because there's consequences to doing that. I mean, if you're going to beg, somebody's got to have something to give you. So
That's true.
not all of us should
Absolutely.
behave the same
Everybody
way.
can be a beggar.
That's right, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, but I think his mentality
Mhm.
we could adopt.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I think that's true.
It'd be hard to be in charge of a group of people of the Franciscans if he
Right.
was actually administering it
Right.
himself and be an individualist like that instead of giving the executive summary.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I don't know how you would do it otherwise.
Yeah. How do you govern a body of people that are all devoted to this?
Yes.
That's a good question.
Pretty games.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
Sam, I was going to say that part in scripture, I wish I knew the reference right off the top of my head, but where they talk about don't ever assume the seat of honor,
Mm-hmm.
but you want to be asked to come there
Yes.
instead of just assume. So it sounds like he really embodied that, which is a neat thing.
Oh, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
the gospel is very evident in his
Yeah.
life.
And he was always, when you hear, when you read the stories of St. Francis, you recognize too that he was always taking every thought captive. Any thought of self-grandeur or any shortcuts that he would allow. If he ever allowed himself to take a shortcut or to slip up, he would immediately seize it and submit himself to some ascetical regimen that we would probably say is way too harsh. But Francis was very eager to take the lowest seat, and if ever he even dreamed of taking a higher seat, he would take that thought captive and repent with extreme humility. It's said that Francis, would throw himself into the snow to quench out the fire of concupiscence within his soul. Right? He was joyful. He was a joyful person, and saw all of those around him with dignity and with love. I would not say that he had a kind of self-hatred that would run against his own idea, his own theology of all things belonging to God, including himself. But he was he allowed no shortcuts with himself, and he would have those who followed him to do the same. But again, he was always graceful. I think I may have shared this. Did I share the story with you guys of when? So for as severe as Francis was, and his regimen for those who followed him, he was always graceful. So there was a time that, as the story goes, in the middle of the night, one of the brothers cried out, "I'm dying," and everybody wakes up, and Francis goes to him and says, "Brother, why did you say you were dying?" And he said, "I'm just so hungry. I'm dying." And so what Francis does, he gets up and he says, "Well, let's get you something to eat." And in order for him not to be ashamed, he eats with him. He shares a meal with this man. So it's not a kind of legalism. He is absolutely willing to forego his fasting in the name of charity and grace. So a very, very interesting, very enigmatic person. Was somebody going to say something?
I was going to say,
Yeah.
it's interesting how he was having people sort of try to break away from the very beginning. It's almost like how the church is, you know, it's like,
Right.
well, I kind of like everything you do, except this one little thing. Do we really
Right.
have to do that? I mean,
Exactly.
he was experiencing that from the very beginning,
Yes,
too.
no, it's
So
true.
like-
It's true. Yeah, compromise is a very easy thing. And it's funny, Katie, that you mentioned that verse about taking the lowest seat and then having the master tell you to come up higher. Because Francis spent his whole life, or at least his whole life after his conversion, his transformation, pursuing poverty and pursuing the lowest seat as best he could. And then, like 2 years after he dies, he's canonized as a saint in the church. He was certainly called up higher, so to speak. Just sort of an interesting little biographical detail. Any other thoughts before we close for today? Well, next Sunday we're going to continue with, what chapter are we on now? Chapter 7. And the next chapter is called The Three Orders. The Three Orders. And just to give you a little preview, what that means, the first order is the group of men that first followed Francis. The second order refers to when Saint Clare of Assisi came to Francis and says, hey, I want to get in on this. And Francis says, okay, let me figure this out. And eventually a Franciscan order of women is formed, which comes to be known later on as the Order of Poor Clares. And then the third order is really not so much an order of professed monastics. It refers to people like you and me who have families, have jobs, who just can't go and be a Franciscan. We can't do that, but we want to follow Francis as much as we can, and so we join this third order, which is just kind of a loose fellowship of people that want to follow the example of Francis. So those are the three orders. If you ever hear somebody say that they are a Franciscan tertiary, that means they're part of the third order of St. Francis. Yeah, it's interesting stuff, and we'll get into that development next week. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Father.
If you want to see that image, I can open up my computer for you here, and you can see that early image of St. Francis. Thank you very much.
I was telling how you bring these bags for the kids every week. Except this week.
Barbara doing okay? No.
He's not sure what are.
Well, tell her we said hi, Larry.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
No.
I got the red box in the phone.
Yeah. We got the wagon out here.
It's in the,
Okay.